Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, the National Flood Insurance Program is in trouble, and everyone in this building knows it. Everyone in Washington knows it. It's fiscally unsustainable because it is, by its nature, structurally unsound. And yet, here we are again, for the 7th straight time in just 6 years, considering so-called straight reauthorization. Straight. Yes, that's the word that Washington uses. That's what Washington describes. It's the word that Washington uses when Republicans and Democrats, after burning the midday oil for 2.5 days a week for a few months, decide together that a dysfunctional program, $20 billion in debt, is in fact perfect. And so we're planning to rubber stamp a continuation of its dysfunctional status quo. Swamp Top aside here, Mr. President, this is the opposite of straight. This is the definition of crooked and swampy. Here are the facts. The National Flood Insurance Program creates a government monopoly to insure some of the most expensive real estate in the entire world. We're talking about homes and homeowners that the private sector would be falling all over itself to insure if given the opportunity to do so. The incentives are there for flood insurance to be a vast, profitable industry, one creating jobs and opportunity for thousands of Americans. But no, in our unearned but infinite confidence, Congress has assured the American people, we got this. We got this, we as in Washington. Except the problem, Mr. President, is we don't. Congress's answer to private insurance is $20 billion in debt, more just a few months after receiving a $16 billion taxpayer bailout. Why is Nfip losing money faster than Congress can spend it? Well, because the program doesn't charge policyholders market rates for insurance. It offers them a special below-market rate, despite the fact that we know floodplains are dangerous. That's why we call them floodplains and not puppy dog and ice cream planes. We also know for a fact that the subsidized premiums will lead inevitably to shortfalls, debt, and hence to taxpayer bailouts. Here, one might recall the old quip that insanity involves doing the same thing over and over and hoping for different results. But Congress isn't insane. We know exactly what we're doing and why. Recall the last time Nfip was reformed was about 6 years ago in its 2012 reauthorization. That bill, for the first time in a long time, reined in some of the program's worst distortions. For reformers on the left and right, it was a sign of hope. The problem was the reforms worked. Nfip and its artificially low premiums actually started to climb toward reality-based levels, market-based levels. We, of course, couldn't have that. So in 2014, Congress stepped in and repealed many of those same reforms that were working, reforms that were put in place in 2012. That is the broken status quo we're being asked to perpetuate today. If this bill were any less serious, it would be written in crayon. The question is why? If the flood insurance program is so obviously and terribly flawed, Mr. President, why is it so resistant to reform? Why are we so resistant to reforming it? The answer is that, like most inexplicably durable federal programs, this is a program that quietly serves the interests of the well-to-do at the expense of working and middle-class American families. Proponents of the program would have us believe that Nfip is essentially there to be protecting innocent victims who just happen to live in low-lying communities and they can't afford flood insurance. But this argument is absurd. First of all, if homeowners can't afford to insure their homes, then in reality they can't afford those very same homes. Second, many of the areas Washington calls floodplains are really just property near water. Residences there are expensive for lots of reasons. But as anyone who knows anything about real estate can tell you, the biggest reason is location, location, location. These homes are expensive because lots of people want to live there, among them wealthy people who bid up the price. Wealthy people, Mr. President, is another way of saying people who can afford high-risk insurance premiums without taxpayer subsidies covered by Washington, D.C. over and over and over again. Now, in fairness, other floodplains are not necessarily home to multi-million-dollar beach houses, but simply normal neighborhoods in low-lying locales. But in either case, the potential for flooding makes living in these areas more dangerous and more expensive. So in both cases, it's unfair to ask taxpayers to make expensive, dangerous homes, 25% of which are vacation homes, artificially more affordable. It's unfair and it's unsustainable to hardworking, poor, and middle-class American families. The failure of the flood insurance program is not an economic theory. It's not a matter of ideological speculation. It is, in fact, a fact. No amount of money will change that. The problem with NFIP, as with almost all wasteful federal programs, is not the price tag itself, but the underlying policy. It doesn't work as currently structured because it can't. Yet, despite decades of failure and folly, NFIP remains unchanged as nothing more or less than a subsidy for people to live in places we know are probably going to get flooded. It's tempting to call this a recipe for losing money. But as we know, Mr. President, federal programs never actually lose money. Whether it's waste, fraud, or abuse, someone, somewhere, pockets that money. And in the case of the NFIP, as with so many other government programs, the winners are, well, see for yourself. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the median value of an NFIP-insured home is about twice that of the average American home. A 2015 study by the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth found that, quote, an inverse relationship between insurance premiums paid and total property value, close quote. In other words, quote, the greater the average property value, the lower the average premium paid. Likewise, a 2016 study from the University of Michigan Law School found data, quote, suggesting that zip codes with higher valued homes receive higher per policy subsidies. Now, we all know there are worthy and sympathetic beneficiaries of NFIP, as there are for every government program. But in the aggregate, in the big picture, the NFIP simply redistributes money from non-wealthy people to wealthy people, from less wealthy people to more wealthy people. And to believe otherwise is to indulge what might be called an actuarial science denial. This isn't alchemy. This isn't voodoo. Actuaries already know how much flood insurance should cost. Of course, they also know how much Obamacare, Medicare, Social Security are going to cost, and Congress is getting terrifyingly good at ignoring actuaries and actuarial science in general. But as with our entitlement programs, politicians just want to pretend that NFIP can magically charge less and spend more and not leave future taxpayers holding the bag. Mr. President, it's long past time to set aside this farcical, magical type of thinking. Neither former President Obama nor King Canute 1,000 years ago, nor the NFIP today has the power to stop the rise of the oceans. What we can do is prepare through mitigation, through insurance, and through proven platforms of success. Senators Heller and Tester have a bill that would allow private insurers to compete with NFIP. I wholeheartedly support their bill and can cite Utah's successful embrace of private flood insurance as strong evidence in favor of that approach. Senators Crapo and Brown have a bill that would improve flood mapping and insist on community preparation for flooding as a condition for Nfip coverage. This is not too much for the American people to ask, either of their affluent, flood-prone neighbors or of their sworn representatives in Congress. Nor is the amendment I'm offering. My amendment would leave the program, broken as it is, exactly the same, only for today's purposes with one small change. It would cap eligibility for Nfip insurance at homes worth more than $2.5 million. Anything under that, fine, and they can enjoy the cut rate premiums. But the taxpayers should not pay any amount of coverage for the top 1% that can afford a new home of $2.5 million, a $2.5 million new beach home. All my amendment says is that people who can afford a multi-million-dollar waterfront home should be able to afford to insure those homes on their own without a government subsidy paid for by America's poor and middle class. With the stock market near all-time highs, with the corporate tax cut driving up profits, I think it's eminently reasonable, an eminently reasonable time to ask multimillionaires to insure their beach houses without the welfare assistance of hardworking taxpayers who make a fraction of their income. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that it be in order for the Committee on Banking to be discharged from further consideration of S. 3128, and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the Lee Amendment be agreed to, that the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.